Welcome to Sewer Mutant, the comic book podcast for weirdos like you. I'm Clint Finley, and I'm joined, as always, by my host, John Eckelberry. Our music is by Crudler. How are you doing today, John?
Excellent. Always happy to be here.
Yeah, I just finished doing my taxes today, so there's nothing quite like that to make you want to put on a Guy Fawkes mask and burn the whole system down. So, yeah, let's jump into it. But first, I'm going to do an icebreaker. So I always ask John these. He never knows what I'm going to ask him. So I wanted to ask you this time, John, interests outside of comic books. But we would each just name one interest that we have outside of comics.
All right, that sounds good. I suppose that mine would be movies. I used to watch a ton of movies, but much like comic books, I kind of drifted away and haven't watched as many. I only made it to the theater 8 times last year, which I feel like is a sad number, but maybe to people that don't go to the movies, that's not a small number. I don't know.
Yeah, you may have had me beat, and I feel like I go like a fair amount, but it feels harder and harder to get out of the house these days. And I don't even have kids, and you've definitely got a responsibility there that I do not have. And I imagine that would also affect what types of movies you can watch at different times.
Yeah, typically in the house, there's only children's programming on the TV, but me and one of my other dad friends that lives a couple blocks down the street occasionally sneak away and go see a movie together. So we try to get to the ones that look good.
Cool. So for me, I'm going to say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's something I've been doing for about a year and a half now. It's one of the most challenging and fun things that I've ever done. You know, I didn't really have any particular interest in grappling arts before. It was more a little bit of a background going back to when I was a kid in like striking arts like karate, Muay Thai. But once I tried grappling, I was just totally hooked. It's actually like puzzle solving, but you solve puzzles with your body. And so, yeah, I highly recommend it if anyone out there is interested in getting into martial arts or doing more physical activity. Grant Morrison said that they got into Jeet Kune Do, which is a martial art based on Bruce Lee's philosophy and style, because they wanted to be more super heroic. So, you know, if that's something that appeals to you, that's an option out there. Well, you know, who else had interests outside of comic books is Alan Moore and Steve Moore, who both were contributors to Warrior Magazine, which is what we're talking about today. So previously, we covered the first 13 issues of Warrior Magazine. Actually, no, we stopped at 12 issues of Warrior Magazine, and now we're jumping into the remainder of those issues. John, do you want to maybe remind us a little bit of what Warrior is and where we left off?
Yeah, so Warrior is a British anthology magazine that had a lot of excellent British talent work on it. The first year was pretty solid. They had 4 strips that ran for most of the issues, and then they had some one-offs by other creators. It was edited by a guy named Des Skin, who goes through and edits the whole series, and also edited a magazine called Comics International for several years. And it was the start of some great stuff for Alan Moore and several great artists that we've enjoyed from the British scene that have gone on to do other American work.
Yeah, and in particular, V for Vendetta and Marvelman were first serialized in Warrior. So those are the two best known and longest lasting influence coming out of that magazine. And it was really Alan Moore's kind of like his real breakout work there. He'd been doing comics for a few years before that. He was publishing strips in a music magazine called Sounds. He was doing work for 2000 AD. Before that, he had done some Doctor Who magazine, and he did some stuff for a Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, British black and white anthology comic as well. But this is really what put him on the map, and V for Vendetta remains one of his best known works. I think Marvelman is also a really well remembered one, but because it was out of print for so long, I think it's a little bit less remembered than it probably deserves to be. But yeah, so that's a little bit of the context coming into this. Now, the second half of it, we wanted to kind of focus more on the impact that Warrior had in this episode rather than our opinions of the material, which is what we covered mostly last time around. But I do have to say, like, I feel like there was a pretty steep decline in the overall quality of the magazine in the latter half of it, especially the last few months of it, where it seemed like more of it was being written by Des Skin, who wasn't a great writer or a bad writer, but it just, he wasn't, I think, up to the had been set in the earlier issues of Warrior. And Steve Dillon, who drew the Axel Press Button series that was written by Steve Moore, departed at some point. And I guess the artist wasn't on that. The replacement artists weren't bad or anything, but I don't know. It just really did not sing the same way anymore.
It didn't feel the same to me either. But interestingly, the replacement artists. Well, first they reprinted the Christmas special that was from Sounds Magazine that was actually illustrated by Alan Moore, and that was really cool to see. And then as a replacement for Steve Dillon, they had Alan Davis. So it's really interesting. Alan Davis stops drawing Marvelman, which is like their premier strip, and that strip disappears from the book in issue 21, and he starts drawing Press Button for the rest of the series. Or at least the rest of the episodes that Press Button is in.
I thought somebody else was on it too for a while, but I don't know. Yeah. So do you have any other thoughts? One other thing I kind of wanted to jump to real quick was one of the other interesting things about this, the latter half, is that there were interviews with a lot of the creators. It was like the sweatshop talks, as they described them. And there's one where Steve Moore essentially interviews himself, because he wrote the Press Button books or strips under the name Pedro Henry. And so there's this one that's Pedro Henry interviewing Steve Moore, or the other way around, I forget which. And something that stood out in it to me was that Steve Moore talked a lot in that about how he was trying to experiment more. He was being influenced a lot by manga and by Japanese cinema, and that he was trying to move more towards having his stories told more visually or through the dialogue. And that's something I've talked about as being one of the really interesting shifts in comics storytelling, that it didn't necessarily start in the Dark Age, but it accelerated in the Dark Age. And I mean, the shift has never really fully happened. I mean, there's still exposition in comics today and everything. Comics just used to be so much more exposition heavy. So it was interesting that Steve Moore had this awareness that comics needed to change, and that his comics needed to change even. But looking at Twilight World, which was one of the new strips that he did in the kind of latter half of Warrior, even though he didn't make it to the end of the series, he just replaced the exposition with having the character talking to a computer. He succeeded in having it just be dialogue, which is one of his stated goals, but it was still just exposition. And it was actually, for me, I thought it was really annoying, because he didn't include what the computer was saying to the main character. So the main character was constantly having to repeat what the computer was saying to him. So it was actually kind of worse than a traditional way of doing exposition in comics. Sorry to start off on a negative, but I don't know. As we chart the course of creators trying to figure out how to do better with the medium, that kind of stood out to me.
Well, they also, that strip that you're talking about, Twilight World, I was kind of excited. The issue before it starts, they kind of had a text piece where he talked about the buildup of it and, the idea for it. And I thought, oh yeah, that sounds cool. And I had seen the artist's work, Jim. I hope I don't butcher his last name, but Jim Bikey. That might be pronouncing his last name wrong, but I had read other stuff that he'd done with Alan Moore in 2000 AD previously, and I thought it'll be cool to see him working with Steve Moore. And the art was fine in the strip, but the strip itself was not very strong, and they ran it for 4 issues, and then they just dropped it, and it never recurred. So they must have realized that it wasn't working.
Yeah, I thought the art was great. I really liked the art in it. I will say that for it. But yeah, that was just one of a number of examples of the quality starting to drop off on the book. You'd see like there was a lot more TNA in it the last several issues. Readers even started to notice, like in the letters column, some of that effort to try to get, I guess, like a cheap sales boost. And it seems not to have worked, because the magazine was, for better or worse, canceled with issue 26. But the influence of it clearly has lived on. So you had mentioned a while back that you thought that Faust was probably pretty clearly influenced by it, by particularly V for Vendetta. I was wondering if you wanted to say more on that.
Well, yeah, I don't know. We were talking a bit about the outlaw comics that we enjoyed, and if Warrior might have had an influence, and I don't know if those creators had access to these magazines or not. I had actually thought a lot about when I was starting to read V for Vendetta again. I hadn't read it in years when we started reading it for this, and I actually was thinking about how much it reminded me of The Crow. You know, both the way the main character carries himself with the mask and with his kind of the way that he speaks in poetry. And I guess you could apply that to Faust as well, you know, the kind of grotesque masked guy behind the scenes. But I think it's a lot closer to The Crow for me than to Faust, the way it's presented in the stark. I mean, I guess them both being in black and white doesn't hurt. And I have seen early illustrations when O'Barr was starting to work on The Crow in the early 80s. He had considered having Eric wear a mask rather than having his face painted, but then he opted to have the face paint instead. But I can definitely see some similarities there, and I have no idea if he was influenced at all by that. But I feel like they feel very similar, and they're of a similar time.
Yeah, I saw that as well. The second time through, it's kind of funny that the first time I don't think it ever occurred to me that it may have influenced O'Barr and the Crow, but I couldn't not see it this time through. And O'Barr, if the those early drawings, I think the earliest one is dated 1981, which would have been before Warrior, if the dating on that is correct. But the DC reprints started, I think, in 87 or 88, which was when he was probably really ramping up, finishing the first parts of it for Caliber. Uh, I mean, it seems like it would definitely have been on his radar by that point. You could even wonder if maybe that was part of why he decided not to use a mask. If he had started out wanting to have the character have a mask and then saw, oh, that's going to make it look too much like V for Vendetta. I've got to do something else. I could imagine that. But yeah, it's hard to know. I don't think O'Barr, in any of the interviews I've read, I don't think he's ever talked about it, but it definitely seems likely. And then Marvelman, something I was just kind of poking around and I hadn't realized this. Wolverine didn't have so I'll back up 1 second. To the original Marvelman character dates back to the 50s, and he was kind of a replacement for Captain Marvel, the original Shazam Captain Marvel. The original stories were, they were definitely of the time of the 50s and 60s era of superhero comics, and involved like a kid who would say a magic word, transform into a superhero. And Moore's revision to that was essentially that, yes, he could say a magic word and transform into a superhero, but all of those adventures were imaginary. They were false memories implanted essentially by a government program where they were experimenting with alien technology. So, and it's you can see the influence of that like all over comic books now. And so I was thinking, well, I guess there was Wolverine before that. And then I looked a little bit into the history of Wolverine, and he didn't actually have memory problems or false memories for quite a while. The false memories thing, from what I've read, didn't start until 1991 in Wolverine number 48 by Larry Hama. So well after Marvelman. I mean, I think you can see the influence of Marvelman with like pretty like the government stuff and alien technology stuff, but just, I guess, the violence of it and so many different aspects of it, all over comics, but particularly Image and Wildstorm. I feel like you can draw a really straight line from Marvelman to Wildcats to Gen 13 to The Authority, starting right there with those early Warrior issues that I'm sure must have been passed around amongst comics creators back in the day and left a mark there.
You even see it in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Like DC did a reboot of the Archie characters, the Archie superheroes, and one of those characters was the Comet. And the reboot of that character, I didn't read the 40s and 50s version of that character, but the rebooted version definitely takes some things from Marvelman / Miracleman, even down to the idea of the character like kind of swapping bodies in like a different time and space or whatever in order to inhabit this like superhero body when they've, powered up or changed or whatever. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I think that run was something that was talked about by fans for a long time. And like you mentioned, it kind of went out of print and people had a hard time getting it. And then it almost became more known for the legal battle surrounding it rather than for the story itself. But that's a whole nother story. The Wolverine connection is really interesting though. That's not a thing that I'd thought about. Certainly in Weapon X and Barry Windsor Smith's run, it's shown that Logan doesn't remember any of that, but it doesn't necessarily go into false memories. Although I think you had mentioned that they do use the idea of kind of the VR helmet, that he wears in Weapon X in order to run some kind of like programming and controlling on him.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like they're implying that they're showing him false memories. It's like they're doing it for training purposes when they're in that series. And yeah, they established that he had some memory gaps going back to like 1986 in Alpha Flight. So that
And
there
even
was
that's after Warrior, because that Warrior
yeah,
would have been in the preceding years, just a couple of years right before it.
yeah. So yeah, I don't know if that was what influenced Larry Hama to go with the false memory route or not. Moore was definitely there before him. Yeah, I really feel again. Yeah, it's hard not to see that influence all over the place. The only thing I was thinking about reading through it was even as the press button stories really started to lose me. The one thing that I thought of was Lobo. Uh, and realized that Press Button felt a lot like that character. Press Button has a something particular about the brand of humor there and his sort of persona that it feels like it has had reverberations in other characters further down the line. One of the things I tried to look into a little bit was what sort of impact it was having at the time. And going back to issue 4 of Warrior, there was a letter by Warren Ellis when he was about 13 years old, and he writes in it, "You're going places, people. Don't fumble it now." And I think that kind of sums up the reaction to Warrior, at least as expressed in the letters column. It seemed like people knew that they were reading something special, but not necessarily that they were witnessing comics history, like a complete revolution of the medium, or at least of superheroes. And I think that's kind of normal. People don't always realize how important something is until later. But I had kind of this impression from reading things, particularly like Grant Morrison's Super Gods book, gave me more of an impression of Marvelman, just kind of like creating an instant revolution of superhero comics. That's not really exactly what happened. It took some time.
Well, and maybe for him too, I mean, he's British. Like it would have hit him first, if he was a reader at that age. And you even get to see the transition. Grant Morrison does a script in issue 26 for the Liberators, and so you kind of see at the very end of Warrior, you see that handoff. When Alan Moore had previously and Steve Moore had been like the primary scribes in those last few issues. Des Skin, as you mentioned, is writing a bunch of stuff, and then Grant Morrison comes in and writes a script in the very last issue.
Yeah, and Morrison has definitely written that that Warrior was what inspired them to get back to try their hand at comics again. That they had actually been doing professional comics as long as Alan Moore. Morrison was doing as a teenager a strip in a Glasgow newspaper called the strip was called Captain Clyde, and they had some stuff in an anthology called New Myths around that same time in the late 70s. And then they just took a break from comics for a while and came back to it after Warrior. So there was definitely an impact there, but just it wasn't like a overnight change in the industry like I thought there might have been. I spent some time going through a bunch of American comics magazines from the early 80s to see if Warrior was talked about, and it was barely on anyone's radar. The Comics Journal had an ad for it in '83. There was an interview with a 2000 AD editor in Comics Interview in 1984, Richard Burton, where he just mentioned Warrior and called out Marvelman and V for Vendetta as the best strips from it. And there was a comic scene profile of Brian Bolland in 1982 that mentioned his Zerk strip that I think was in Warrior number 4 or so. But yeah, just not a whole lot of recognition on our side of the pond, at least in those early days.
Yeah, and then of course, the stuff started getting reprinted. I'm trying to remember how far along regular Warrior was. I made a note here someplace that they eventually publish, yeah, here it's in issue 24. So at the end of year 2, there's an advertisement that Press Button's going to be a color comic and that it's going to be, come out in regular comic size. And so even as this magazine is dying, the content from it goes forward because you get Press Button and you get Miracleman and you get V, published by other publishers in the States, and then they get that exposure that they didn't have earlier on.
Yeah. So, and I think each of those continued beyond what was in Warrior.
Yes.
I think there were two different Press Button series, one that reprinted the Warrior stuff, and then a second one that had some original material. And then, of course, Marvelman continued on. V for Vendetta was eventually concluded in by DC Comics. Now, one of the things I hadn't really realized or thought about was that the end of Warrior isn't until 1986, so it doesn't end until after Crisis on Infinite Earths is already out, and after Moore has already either completed or almost done with his Swamp Thing run. There was comics were already starting to have that big change over here by the time Warrior was actually finished. And then Moore's run on Marvelman, or rather Miracleman as it became in the US, didn't end until 88 or 89. So it was after Watchmen even was completed when he completed his run on Miracleman. So that's actually kind of a later statement on superheroes from him than Watchmen was.
And the name change, of course, was due to some of the legal stuff, which is all kind of interesting. Nobody cared when Marvelman was a strip inside of Warrior magazine, but once they published the Marvelman special, which wasn't even really anything, it was just a framing story by Moore with a bunch of reprints from the older stuff. It is kind of it's kind of a shame that they even published it at all, because maybe if they hadn't, maybe they wouldn't have gotten into legal trouble with Marvel. But Marvel didn't like the idea of them using the name, and so they sent cease and desist letters, and Skin publishes a couple of those in the last couple issues of Warrior. He also tries to use them as kind of an excuse as why Marvelman's not appearing in the book anymore, but it seems from other interviews and things that I've read that Alan Moore and Alan Davis kind of had a falling out, and so that was kind of why there weren't any fresh Marvelman stories. It just kind of ends, on a cliffhanger in issue 21, and you don't see him come back in Warrior again after that. And then when the Eclipse stuff starts reprinting new material, it's not by Davis. It's by a different artist, Chuck Beckham, and then later John Totleben. But Davis doesn't ever draw Marvelman again after that.
Yeah. So I don't know much about the. There's literally two whole books about.
I've got them both.
And about Miracleman and Marvelman and the saga of how all of that unfolded. There's a lot of bad blood, I guess, between a lot of the people that were involved, and probably best for us not to get into that in the podcast because it's way too much detail and allegations flying around in all directions to try to untangle. But if anyone's interested, Poison Chalice is still in print. I'm not sure about the other one, but Poison Chalice is more recent. Would have the latest developments with Miracleman finally getting reprinted at Marvel. They still kept it Miracleman because they understandably didn't really want it to be associated too closely with the Marvel brand, I think.
Yeah, it was interesting because they reprinted the old stuff, the Mick Anglo stuff, under the Marvelman name, and they did that as kind of like a hype for the book that would eventually come out. But man, it took them so long. Like, that stuff came out in, I think, 2011, and then they didn't start reprinting the Alan Moore stuff till like 2014. And then, like, by the time they got to the Neil Gaiman stuff down the line, it was so much later that I didn't even care anymore. It took them like a decade or more to get all that stuff out. I think by the time they did their version of the Silver Age, it was like 2023 or 2024. So that's a whole nother saga that we could do a whole episode on Miracleman at some point.
And I think we've talked about wanting to do an episode on the endings of Marvelman or Miracleman and V for Vendetta. So we can
well, and also the continuations in A1 that probably people are less familiar with. The other characters that went on and had their stories concluded elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I thought that might be worth touching on here a little bit. Warrior ended with 26. So with issue 25, it merged with another Des Skin magazine called Halls of Horror. I guess he was hoping that the combined sales of the two. So that's also a rather British tradition of like merging magazines when the sales on one of them wasn't doing so well. They tried that, clearly didn't work.
Well, and there wasn't much horror content that got added, I didn't feel like. They said that they merged the magazines, but the magazine largely just continued as Warrior. I mean, I didn't see really any stories in there hardly. They reprinted a couple earlier Shandor stories in those last couple issues. They reprinted, whether it was a reprint or maybe it was a new one that they got Bolton to do, but it's just like a 2-page that summarizes the earlier stuff. And then they had another artist do like a bridging story that takes us from the Dracula movie that he was in, that character was in, to the first Shandor series, and it kind of connects them.
Yeah.
Year 2 ends the Shandor story. Shandor went all the way to the end of year 2, and one of the things, I know that we don't want this whole thing to be about just how we felt about it, but one of the things I wanted to do reading the second half of Warrior was to give Shandor another chance, because I kind of ragged on Shandor when we read the first half. I didn't think it was that strong, and I didn't really feel like it held my attention. And after I read some good interviews with Steve Moore, I thought, I gotta go back and actually read this time and see what I think. And I think Shandor had a pretty strong ending in its last couple issues. There's a cool twist in issue 23, a kind of revelation about in that story where like demons come from, like the origins of demons. And then in issue 24, there's like just such a bleak ending for that story. I'm like, oh my God, like this is it? You've wrapped it up. This is where your hero ends. And
yeah.
I really, it gave me a different appreciation for the whole thing. Sometimes like, if a movie is kind of ho-hum, but it has like a really good ending, it almost makes you re-examine the rest of it. And it really kind of made me want to look at Shandor again. And then we found out about these A1 publications where a lot of these creators went after they kind of separated from Des Skin, and they were publishing their own little continuations. And in one of those, Steve Moore does kind of a coda to the whole Shandor series, and that's actually pretty cool and interesting as well.
Yeah. I also ended up flipping on Shandor, where I think in the first half, I was all in on Press Button and not so keen on Shandor. And in that second half of the series, it flipped for me. Like I think a big part of what happened though is when they brought back I don't know how to say her name exactly, Dharamshila, the demoness character, and started doing more with demons and hell. And that's just a lot cooler. It's just more fun to
it's
to
more
read
metal.
than Shandor kind of like roaming around in Romania talking to people or whatever. Yeah, it definitely picked up there at the end. There's also that great like goat-headed demon character that's in it towards the end that explains like where demons come from. Yeah, and that A1 story, it's in a little bit exploitative, but the A1 Bikini Confidential special, I think. And,
yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, it's a strange little book, but and the ending is very in that, like the coda as you described it gets very meta, but in a cool way. It also has something I found really entertaining, where they go to one of the different, like to another hell dimension or something, and find these demons that are meditating, and Jerem Sheila's like, well, they don't do anything evil, and the goat-headed demon is like, no, they've gone beyond good and evil, and it just this is sort of funny to me. I'm just like, it's like the Buddhist, or like the demons found like Buddhism on their own, essentially. Like I don't know, it's I thought it was clever and interesting, and something I'll probably try to steal someday or something. Yeah. So yeah, let's say a little bit more maybe on A1. That was Gary Leach, who drew the early Marvelman stories and was the art director of Warrior. A1 came out as a perfect bound, but otherwise like a normal comic book size. It had a lot of North American creators in it as well as British creators. And I don't know if it sold any better than Warrior did, but they made it. I think they always planned it to be 6 issues plus the bikini special, and they did it, and then they came back later with some other stuff that is a bit of a spiritual successor to Warrior in that it's Gary Leach, and also the Bo Jeffries saga continues through those.
And Zerk as well. So we get Bo Jeffries comes back, Zerk comes back. The other guy that ran it with Gary Leach was Dave Elliott.
Okay.
And it was Atomica Press. And the only other thing that I had ever been familiar with them is they did a Simon Bisley and some other creators did this thing called Monster Massacre. There was a special, and the only reason I know about it is because there was a James O'Barr story in one of them.
Right. Yeah.
But that was probably, they kept all this stuff alive. They kept all these series. And if you look at the creators, especially on the Bikini Confidential issue, you see a lot of names from Warrior. You've got Brian Boland, Gary Leach, Alan Moore, Steve Parkhouse, John Bolton, Alan Davis. All of those guys worked on Warrior. And then you have a few other big British names on there with them, from the next generation. But pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. You said Dave Elliott? Yeah, he also ran Tundra UK. So there was the UK wing of Kevin Eastman's comics company, and I'm not sure if Gary Leach was involved in that as well. But it seems like Atomica basically just became Tundra UK for a while. Got flooded with got flooded with money, and you can kind of see that overlap of creative people. That there's a lot of people who did work for Tundra in the A1 anthology. And then obviously James O'Barr did The Crow at Tundra and ended up in the later Atomica / Black Ball story. So there's some interesting continuity there. And then another fun fact is that the founders of Boom Studios they had originally worked at Malibu Comics in, I think, marketing, and then took a break from comics for a while and came back to it, essentially helping restart Atomica with some Keith Giffen projects. Keith Giffen encouraged them to start their own company, so they started Boom Studios. So there's this interesting kind of continuity where you can go from Warrior to Atomica to Tundra to Boom. So in a way, there's it kind of lives on, but in America with people who weren't even around yet for Warrior, but. I don't know. Maybe I'm kidding myself there, but I don't know. I like to think that the torch kind of keeps getting passed in some way. There was also another kind of Warrior coda in Comics International. I didn't write down the.
I got it. It's issue 67. And it was the Warrior 1996 spring special. So it was a flip book. It was Comics International, just their regular publication. But if you flipped it on the back, it had the Warrior special. And all it really was stuff that Deathskin had in a drawer that hadn't been printed. It's the second half of Grant Morrison's Liberator's story, and then another Big Ben story that was in the drawer. Can I just talk about how terrible Big Ben is? So Big Ben was like one of the things that I thought I was going to like in the second half. I was really looking forward to it. And it's absolute garbage. Like, it's probably the worst thing in the whole magazine. Like, it's poorly written and poorly drawn. And I thought that we were going to get some, like, kind of a cool little, like, James Bond kind of thing or whatever. And he doesn't really resemble the version of the character that appeared earlier in Miracleman, and then who I guess appears later in the Miracleman continuation. Like, that other version goes on and becomes the British Bulldog, and he's his own character. But this version of Big Ben is just, I don't know, man. Like, they could have just told like a James Bond story, but instead they have this really convoluted kind of storyline, and then they reveal that like he's an alien, he's like a shape-shifting alien, and I don't know how that ties into the whole cosmology of the Warrior universe. So I guess I mentioned this in the last episode, but I guess it's worth mentioning again. In issue 14, there's a piece that talks about how all of the quality stories kind of appear in the same universe, and they make them appear kind of far enough apart on the timescale that they don't have to do crossovers or anything. But ostensibly, all these things are happening in the same timeline. So like V and Marvelman and Press Button are all like in the same world. And I just hate the idea of this like Big Ben thing that doesn't seem to actually even fit with the version in Marvelman. And yeah, I don't know. It was a huge miss for me. I was glad I liked Shandor because I didn't like Big Ben at all.
Yeah, Big Ben was was a disappointment. I don't think I hated it as much as you did, but it is really like Deathskin just didn't seem to be able to decide what he wanted to do, because it starts out and it's like a parody of kind of those old British spy stories like James Bond and Danger Man.
They actually have a reference to the prisoner in it. There's
Yeah,
a issue that has called Die the Death, DAI, that villain is it's Patrick McGowan from The Prisoner. I mean, he looks
yeah.
just like him, he dresses just like him, he quotes the show, which I hate because I love that show and I hate this strip. And so it like makes me like it even less because I'm like, oh man, you're quoting something good, but I don't like that you're doing it.
Yeah, so it starts out and he's it seems like it's trying to be a parody of that stuff, but it's not funny mostly. Actually, the very first one I did like the bit of like the guy like going through his inventory of like all the weapons he's got, and then like a little girl knocks him out with a yo-yo and he's still thinking about his inventory as he blacks out, and it's just like
Well,
he
I
had
guess
all this
there's
stuff
that.
and it didn't help him at all. Yeah, I thought that was a funny gag, and so I was like, okay, this could be okay, and then it's not okay. And but then it turns into like a Miracleman knockoff where it starts to be about like all that British spy stuff was actually like false memories, or like memories that he was using to try to not get his mind read. That was a little unclear to me. And yeah, it seemed like he was really wanting to pull an Alan Moore there, but not really pulling it off. And that was too bad. Yeah, Liberator, I didn't really understand it either. The first part was written by Deskin, and then Grant Morrison took it over, um, and maybe it just never got enough material off the ground to make any sort of assessment of it. But it didn't seem very good.
It had nice art.
I
I can say that about it. Liberators had decent art.
Yeah, yeah, Big Ben could definitely have been better. Yeah, there's also one other noteworthy thing in that later run was a story called Bogey, and I think that's probably a reference to Humphrey Bogart, because he's a private detective in the future. Even though it hardly matters at all that it's the first one, I guess it kind of matters that it's the future, and then after that, it doesn't matter, and it barely even seems like it's the future. But I really like the art in it, and the stories are okay. It didn't, I didn't hate them. But what's actually notable about them is that a lot of them were done on a 9 a panel grid or a 6 panel grid, and that was a big influence on Dave Gibbons doing the 9 panel grids in Watchmen, which was a total surprise that ended up being that Bogey of all things out of Warrior was one of the biggest lasting impacts in comics. Was right there, so pretty surprising and kind of cool.
There was a lot of stuff in the second half that I liked, even though I didn't feel like it was as strong. There's one of the issues that Deskin mentions that he kind of felt like by year 2, it was getting a little too standardized for him, that he didn't just want to keep running the same 4 strips. He wanted to bring in different creators and new blood and new stuff. And I don't really necessarily know how successful that was, because I think that those early strips were by and large the better ones. But they did bring in a few kind of interesting things, and some of the stories got to kind of go in different directions, and the ones that did keep going, like Shandor, Steve Moore even had a chance to do Jerem Sheila solo story in the middle there. And I laughed because the script is credited to Steve Moore and Pedro Henry. And I'm like, he must have been feeling very schizophrenic when he wrote that one. He's like, there's a little bit of both of me in this one. In that one, he starts making references to Zazak Greymind, who's this like sorcerer that's behind everything, which in the A1 special, we get to see the fruits of that. But it was interesting flipping back through to see that he'd referenced that early on. So he had been kind of thinking about that some. I did like the Sweatshop Talks features. I thought they were pretty interesting. I understand that for them, it was probably just kind of a cost-saving measure to have a print thing to fill up your magazine with and not to have more drawn stories. But it was actually kind of cool to see all those profiles of the different creators, many from Warrior, but also some earlier ones. There's one of a creator that I hadn't heard of, that was an earlier interview done by David Lloyd and Des Skin with a guy named Frank Lloyd. Let me see here. But anyway, the Sweatshop Talks were really were kind of interesting to me. They did one with John Bolton, and they did one with Gary Leach, and like most of the guys got time to talk about their careers, where they'd been and where they were headed. And then just some of the singles were kind of interesting. Well, I guess I should also mention Tony Weir, who's an artist that was an influence on David Lloyd, is brought in. I don't know if David Lloyd personally asked him because he liked his art or what, but they brought him in to do a couple little segments in V. And so in the 20th issue, there's a silent story called Vincent about this doorman that V kind of takes out some guys in the building. And then as he's charging the doorman just chooses to open it for him and let him out rather than try to stop him. And it kind of shows that the common man is kind of turning to V's side in this fight. But I thought that story was interesting and the art was good. And Weir also did a little bit of the art in the last issue as well. I thought the final V appearance in Warrior 26 was interesting because it ends at a pretty crucial point in the story with a big reveal. And like whether or not you've read V, I don't know, but you'll get to that part in eventually. But
well, I read it, or yeah, I've read it before. But I haven't read the DC issues since 2000. But I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I kind of meant for readers too. Without I don't know how much we can spoil a 30-year-old thing. V's last line in Warrior 26 is "Welcome home," and I think that that's really kind of interesting. That it's the closing of a magazine, it's the closing of a chapter, but it also, for that strip, that there's more. Like after that, and I picked up the Absolute V for Vendetta and just started reading it like right at that point. I didn't bother reading the other stuff even though it was in color, and it was really interesting to see the story keep going on from there.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I just picked up the deluxe edition. It's a little bit I think it's supposed to be the same as the Absolute edition, but a little bit smaller. It's bigger than a normal comic size, not as it's cheaper and not as unwieldy as the Absolute edition, but I haven't started looking at it yet. I came around a lot on V this time too. It was the first time I kind of wasn't that into seeing it in black and white. Well, I think, as I said before, I appreciated what it was doing in black and white, but I think part of I had that my memories of it being in color, and I think that the color made some of the art more clear, even though I think the intention originally was to be a lot of times like a little bit to be very shadowy and sometimes requiring some work to discern what was happening or what was the art, what was being depicted, I guess you could say. But once I got used to it over the course of by the time I got to 26, I was very happy with the story and the art. I definitely got used to it and really appreciate it, and can definitely see why that's one of the longest lasting and most influential strips from that magazine. I don't think we should worry too much about spoiling V for our audience. I think people who are going to try to listen to you guys talk about Warrior magazine are probably going to already be familiar with it.
I think that's fair.
There's probably not too much that we need to say about it anyway. But yeah, I guess though that last chapter, it strikes me. It's something I had read an interview with Moore probably around the time the movie came out. He talked a lot about how one of his key themes in it is that is anti-violent, killing is wrong, and that V killing people is wrong. But he kind of just offhand, because somebody said something about what he did to Evie with like the brainwashing. I don't know if brainwashing is the right word, but what he put her through. He's like, well, I could get more behind that than him killing people. It's just like. Reading it again, man, I don't know about that. I think maybe killing people is better than what he did to Evie in that room. But I don't know. It's definitely despite the black and white artwork, there's definitely not black and white morality in that story, and it even today it's hard to read it and not be affected by it.
Yeah, it really. I hadn't read it in years either, and those chapters in particular, definitely. I mean, when we started Warrior, I was pretty high on it anyway, going into it, and it was interesting to hear your counterpoint on the first half. But I am glad that like you kind of came around to enjoying the later parts of it, because it is one of the more enduring pieces. The artist from Sweatshop Talk Forward, whose name I was searching for, was Frank Bellamy. the interview that they did with him was in 1973 and he died in 1976. But I actually thought that was pretty interesting, and it kind of makes me want to check out some of his art as an influence on these guys, who then, of course, went on to influence a lot of the others. And having Dave Gibbons in on that interview interests me because I'm interested in Gibbons and his contributions,
Yeah.
and his the people that he's influenced later on.
Yeah. I really just skimmed most of the sweatshop talks. Was there anything else in those that you thought was notable that we should go back and look at?
There's just a lot of info in there. There's one with John Bolton that's kind of cool. I don't know. I didn't deep dive on all of them. I skimmed a few of them too, so I wanted to make sure that I got all the actual sequential strips in. So that's probably one of the things that when I sit back down with this, like I power through it once, and now I kind of want to go back to issue 1 and read through the whole thing again and get all the little missing pieces. There's also a not in Warrior, but the same Irish writer that did Poison Chalice did a 6-part Steve Moore interview, which was really good, that I would recommend to anybody. It was called The Hermit of Shooter's Hill. And there's a printed version of it too that you can get through Lulu that I might, but I really enjoyed that. And then I kind of, after the fact, realized that he has done a ton of interviews with Alan Moore and is kind of one of the foremost Alan Moore guys, but that's not how I came around to it. So now, of course, I'm going to go back and read his interviews with Alan Moore as well. I know I'm gonna butcher his name because it's Irish, but it's Pádraig Méalóid. I think that's correct, but perhaps not.
I think you got at least the first name right. I have no idea about the surname. He wrote Poison Chalice, the Miracleman book. So if you're just listening and trying to take notes, like, you can find his name by searching for Poison Chalice Miracleman book. You can kind of go from there. And yeah, the Hermit from Shooter's Hill is easy to find. I think I read that in like 2010 when I listened to the Unearthing audiobook, which is Alan Moore's sort of biography of Steve Moore, but I don't really remember a whole lot about it at this point. So I should revisit it, especially now that I'm a little bit more familiar with Steve Moore's writing.
That's the one that Alan Moore wrote about him. I haven't read that yet.
Yeah. There's a book and a CD. It's more of like a essay length. It's not like a 200-page book or a 10-hour audiobook or anything. I think it's like a 2-hour audiobook or something, and a book with like a lot of photos and stuff. It's interesting and worth it. I think it's worth, even if you don't like Steve Moore's stuff, I think it's worth it to hear what Alan Moore took from Steve Moore and that influence on him philosophically and storytelling wise and all of that. So we're at a period in Alan Moore's work where he had not yet become a practicing occultist in the time of Warrior, but Steve Moore already was. And so there's not a whole lot, I guess, for us to talk about there in terms of Alan Moore, but I think some of what we see in those Shandor stories, particularly where demons come from, and some of that may actually be some of Steve Moore's actual views, but I don't know. It could just be ideas he had for a cool story, but I don't know. Yeah, he was definitely a weird and interesting dude. Something else on the sweatshop talk stuff is that as the magazine went on, something else Deskin started putting more of were more articles and like comics industry news stuff. I don't know if he was already doing Comics International by the time he was putting that stuff into Warrior or not. But I think, like you said, like it's probably was a cheap way to fill some pages. But
I think Comics International started in 1986, if I'm not wrong. So he might have when Warrior folded. When Warrior folded, he might have started doing that like in lieu. He might have just gone to all text.
Yeah, that would make sense. But I think there's maybe a little bit of an interesting feedback loop between Warrior and the Daredevils. So the Daredevils was a magazine that reprinted in black and white Frank Miller's Daredevil for the British audience, but it also serialized a big chunk of Alan Moore and Alan Davis's run on Captain Britain. But it also had a lot of essays and interviews and that sort of material mostly by Alan Moore. And it was something that the way Elizabeth Sandifer had assessed it was that the Daredevils was Marvel's competitor to Warrior magazine, trying to go after a little bit of an older and more sophisticated comics audience than their other British comics anthologies had been. And it also kind of ended up doubling as Alan Moore's fanzine because he was doing a lot of that content for them. There was an essay on sexism in comics. There was an essay on Stan Lee. Steve Moore did one on Japanese comics and then one on Chinese comics. So Moore did fanzine reviews in it. So there's just a lot of stuff. So I think it's possible that Warrior also, that Des Skin started wanting to have more of that type of material in Warrior because the Daredevils had that material, and the Daredevils kind of became what it was because of Warrior. So there's that, maybe
Something
a little
else
bit
for
of a
me to
feedback
hunt
loop.
down. I was
Yeah.
aware of it because of the Captain Britain stories, but I only have a reprint that has just the Captain Britain portions and not the magazines. And now, after hearing you talk about it, I want to go find those magazines and read them.
Yeah, they're spendy, but there are scans of it around, and those are interesting to look at too because you get to see Miller's Daredevil in black and white.
Which seems awesome.
Yeah, and it does make me think that he probably was hip to Jose Munoz by the time that he was doing Daredevil, but there's no like a smoking gun, quote unquote, for that. But it seems like it. He may have been already looking at that by that point. Well, we've gone on for a while here, John. Anything else you want to mention before we wrap up?
I think the only thing of note that I didn't mention is there's two Octrin stories. She's a character from Press Button that she's the character that Mr. Mistralis is cloned from, and they got Cam Kennedy to come and do two stories. Like, he was too busy doing stuff on 2000 AD to do a regular strip for them, but he did at two different points come and illustrate those, and I enjoyed those. I thought they had kind of cool art in them, and he's better known for Rogue Trooper and his work on Judge Dredd. But just lots of talent in this magazine, and it's something that I liked enough that I almost want to go back and read through the whole thing again and pick up the stuff I missed and read all the letters pages and read the rest of the Sweatshop Talks that I didn't get through. Yeah, it's pretty great. I mean, there are some misses, but I think on the whole it's huge.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would recommend it to normal people. um,
Well,
uh,
but weirdos like us.
Yeah, I think there's something, but I think for people that are really interested in comics history, that are really interested in Alan Moore's work and want to see how it appeared in those early forms, the people who want to see Steve Moore's work, because again, like, as we talked about, he didn't do a whole lot in the U.S. This is some of his main work, some of his main body of work is here. It's not my favorite stuff, but I can see why it's important. It's definitely for the right person. It's worth seeking out Warrior Magazine and giving it a look. I think most people would probably be pretty happy with just reading the Eclipse reprints of Miracleman and the DC versions of V for Vendetta. I think those are the very solid versions of those. I don't like the color. I think neither of us like the color in the Marvel reprint of Miracleman, but the Eclipse versions are a lot more affordable now that the Marvel version is out, so you can track those down. I think that the Miracleman does look better in color. I think for V for Vendetta, I wish DC would do a black and white edition. I think they've been doing black and white books. I think they call them the noir editions of things. So
Oh, yeah,
hopefully,
I'd like to see that. And I guess it's worth noting that both for V and for Miracleman, when the stories continued, even though they were being printed in regular sized and regular length books, Moore seemed to kind of hold on to those smaller chapters for a while. Like, he'd do like a 6-page or an 8-page. And even in the early Eclipse reprints, like, sometimes there would just be like, the first half of the book would be Miracleman, and then there'd be something else in the back. There'd be like a press button, or there'd be a reprint of an old Marvelman, or whatever. They don't actually get all the way up to like a full size 22-page book until the last few. That I think the Toddlebin ones are like 16 pages instead. So that's double the 8, but still not as long as a regular American comic.
yeah,
And their last issue 16, I think, is longer. But same thing with V. They did the smaller segments, but they just did more of them together to piece the whole thing together. And I was trying to look at the art in V specifically and see if Lloyd kind of kept the larger sized, or if he started drawing smaller, knowing that it was going to be produced in a regular size comic. It was one of the reasons why I wanted to pick up the Absolute Edition. I got a good deal on it, but also it's just big. And I thought, well, if these were originally magazine size, I think if they might look better reprinted bigger. And it's kind of hard to tell with his style if he just kept going exactly the same way, or if maybe that those issues 8 through 12 or 8 through 10, I think it's 8 through 10, were maybe produced in a slightly different way. But I mean, either way, his art's fantastic, and I really love it. Miracleman's interesting because like there isn't one artist. You've got Leach at the beginning, and then you've got Davis, and then you've got Chuck Austin, and then you've got John Toddleman at the end there. And so you've got a lot of different collaborators.
So I think what's next for us is going to be something we haven't done yet, a full color superhero comic from the United States.
Crazy.
The Death of Captain Marvel. So tune in next time for that and let us know what else you'd like to hear us talk about.